All right. Hey, everyone. I am Michael Scadden, a research associate here with the Jack Gordon Institute of Public Policy, sitting here with Randy Pestana, who is a policy analyst here at the Jack Gordon Institute of Public Policy. And today we are talking about Central America. We actually have the conference on prosperity and security in Central America that's taking place right now, where U.S. and Central American policymakers are in attendance, and they're going over, future U.S. policy in the region and what we're going to be doing down there moving forward. Okay, so Randy,
yes,
how you doing?
I'm doing well.
What's some of your experience with Central America, real quick?
My experience with Central America has pretty much been my whole entire career studying Latin American studies. My focus has primarily been on Central America, looking at the military, looking at the economic systems, looking at general institutions and how we can reduce crime and violence and increase prosperity in the region. So this conference is very timely, particularly with the status of Central America today, but also in the context of my research. So it's very important. I'm very happy that it's being hosted here at FIU.
And who are some of the major players at this conference today?
So certainly the major players from a U.S. perspective is Secretary Kelly of Homeland Security, Secretary Tillerson from the Department of State, and also Secretary Mnuchin from the Department of Treasury. VP Pence just finished up his remarks. He's here as well. But we also have the President of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and the President of Guatemala, Jimmy Morales, as well as the Vice President of El Salvador. So it's a packed lineup. We have representatives from Mexico, from Spain, from Nicaragua, from Haiti. So it's a packed house.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as far as all of those individuals, I think we were talking earlier. Secretary Kelly, formerly General Kelly, has a lot of experience in the region through his work at Southcom, correct? Can you speak to that for like a minute?
Yeah, so General Kelly really led the charge in Central America, worked with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to improve the conditions that ultimately led to the 2013 unaccompanied minors migrant crisis that we saw, where we had over 50,000 youth coming across the border through Mexico, most of them via coyotes, into the U.S., seeking out immigration and political asylum here. So he saw that firsthand, and I think when he became Department of Homeland Security chief, he knew he had to do something if he were to prevent a future migration crisis in the future. Very nice.
Now, just for any of our viewers out there, if you have questions, go ahead and start posting them. We'll get to them towards the end of our little streaming here. All right, great. Now, so with that background information, one of the questions that I'm seeing out there today within the international community, amongst NGOs, is are we going to see a shift in U.S. policy from a more human security-centered approach in terms of development, in terms of economical development in the region, trying to change the conditions that have led to a lot of the violence that we've seen in the area and the mass migrations that have happened? Are we seeing a shift away from that? Are we going to see a shift away from that to and a return to previous policies that were more security institution, more support for like security institutions like the military and police forces down there? What can you tell us about that?
Well, that's the general belief by a lot of people, that that's the approach that Trump's going to take, more hardline approaches that we saw during the so-called war on drugs in the hemisphere. I think it's a little premature to go that route, particularly with General Kelly in the seat. It's no secret that General Kelly is really the one leading these efforts and has worked very closely with Central America in the past as commander of Southcom. So I think he understands that it needs to be a dual approach, one where you combat security, but also look at the underlying conditions, the socioeconomic conditions that ultimately led to the migration crisis in the first place. Security needs to be dealt with. That's a fact. With that said, we also need to look at the underlying conditions, the lack of jobs, the lack of education, the lack of general opportunities in the Northern Triangle, and they can't be mutually exclusive. If not, you're going to fail, and I think General Kelly knows that.
Right. Do you think we're going to see any shift away specifically from combating corruption within some of the institutions down there? Or will we go ahead and continue focusing on that as part of this multifaceted approach?
Well, since 2013, 2014, that's really been the approach of the United States working with Central America through the Plan of the Alliance Northern Triangle, right? Which was to improve rule of law, improve the institutions that ultimately led to record levels of corruption, and the lack of foreign direct investment that coincided with the high levels of violence, right? So I think the approach is going to continue to be the same, although the resources might not be to the degree that they are. So if you look at last year's budget, $750 million, with the majority targeting the Northern Triangle countries, were brought in to improve socioeconomic conditions, to improve rule of law reform, to reform the police, reform the judiciary, reform the prison system. All these things that have led to increased levels of violence, but also have led to lack of opportunities in the countries themselves. So when you have high levels of violence, businesses do not want to go in and invest in those countries. When you have high levels of corruption, businesses do not want to go and invest in those countries. They want stable countries where the economy could grow and they could gain profits. You're not going to see that in a record violence level countries like the Northern Triangle has.
Now, as far as businesses go, and so in this development approach, I've noticed that there's a lot of focus on public-private partnerships lately.
Absolutely.
Now, what can you tell us as far as, one, why public-private partnerships are important to the region, and then two, what U.S. policy has been in the past to help bolster that, and what it might be going forward?
Well, it's important strictly for economic terms, right? The more business that you have in your country, the more jobs, the more opportunities, the more likelihood that you're going to be involved in an actual working capacity as opposed to an illicit.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Have we seen a measurable effect when it comes to public-private partnerships in any specific area in terms of reduction in crime or improved security?
Absolutely, and it doesn't go mutually exclusive. When countries are doing well, when countries are prosperous, low levels of violence, right, you've seen increased investment. That's just across the board, and that's globally, and that's not just a Latin America thing, right? You look at a place like Chile, you have high level of investment by private companies. Why? Because it's a stable democracy, in a sense.
Now, catch me if I'm wrong, but hasn't... So, all right, we know we have all this violence in the region. We've seen, all across Latin America, you have armed groups that later on, through peace processes, or for instance, gang violence in El Salvador, where you're trying to reintegrate some of these groups, right? Has there been a measurable effect in terms of these PPPs on helping the reintegration of some of these groups and therefore creating more stability in the region? That's something you can speak to. It's something that... It's
important. I think it's difficult to truly measure. There are so many economic indicators that you could look at and they kind of contradict one another, right? In some aspects, right? So just looking at GDP per capita, it doesn't account for inequality, right?
Right.
Looking at GDP growth, it doesn't account for inflation a lot of the times, right? There's ways to adjust it. But it's very difficult to really see, particularly in the Central American context, the effectiveness. You have seen economic growth, albeit minimally, in the Northern Triangle, right? You have seen it. You have seen some levels of investment. But you have El Salvador as the most violent region in the world, right? With a homicide rate over 80 because of the gang wars that are going on. You just had a president removed in Guatemala because of corruption allegations for taking handouts from businesses to do business in there. So it's interesting to see, but it's very difficult to truly identify what specific indicator is causing the levels of violence or just lack of economic opportunity.
Now, you mentioned Guatemala. Can we attribute some of the push to root out corruption there to some previous U.S. policies? Have we helped with that at all?
Well, we certainly helped, right? We're going to continue to help economically. I think we realize geography matters and economics coincides with geography in a sense for the United States, right?
Right.
We trade very highly. We're their largest trading partner, both imports and exports, right? So it matters, but they in Guatemala really worked together to try to root out corruption using a program with the United Nations called CICIG, right? This program is independent commission looking at corruption cases to see if there's corruption, if there's legal activities, and ultimately they found that the president and vice president in Guatemala were taking illegal handouts, and so he resigned. He was in prison. So is the vice president. Right now, the U.S. is seeking extradition of Vice President Baldetti over to bring her to the United States on charges of handouts and relations with Los Zetas from Mexico, right?
Right.
So they work together very closely. I think the idea that the U.S. is not going to work with the Northern Triangle is somewhat of a myth. I think you will see some pushback, less reliant on resources, and looking at other partners like Mexico, like Colombia, like Chile, to help work with these countries in a minilateral type way, as opposed to a purely U.S. transactional relationship with the Central American leaders.
Right, over the long term. I just had another thought too. Now, do you know anything about how the U.S. has perhaps also tried to, when it comes to supporting security institutions, as the U.S. also had a policy of working with citizen security and community policing groups and things like that to try and again, have like more of a human security approach to actual physical security.
Yeah, and if you look at the Plan of the Alliance, human rights is a major component of that, as well as rule of law reform. So the idea of the Plan of the Alliance is that we have $750 million dedicated to Central America, but a lot of those percentages are contingent on meeting certain things, like you must begin rule of law reform, reforming the police, you must respect human rights, right? But there is a lot of questions as to, can you really monitor where the human rights violations are coming from? Is it coming from the military? Is it coming from the police? Is it coming from the highest levels of government? It's very difficult to prove these things. There's a lot of allegations out there, but so far the U.S. has really monitored. U.S. does not give out money without conditions, and they're fair conditions. Maintain the democracy, maintain human rights, have rule of law reform, trying to eliminate corruption. I think these are good goals, but there certainly has to be respect for those other indicators to continue the aid levels that you've seen.
Out of all these countries in the region, what are a few examples of success in terms of U.S. policy in the region? Like, let's say 3 good examples of success in any given country.
Well, I think
because we know that there's been some rising violence, murder rates, things like that. So, where have the successes actually been that we can point to and say, hey, this has been working?
Well, it depends how you define success, right?
Right.
So, success is determined by a number of things, right? So, Colombia is the case that Secretary Kelly and a lot of people looking at Latin America, particularly U.S. policy in Latin America, will point to Plan Colombia and the subsequent Paz Colombia that just passed after the peace deal, right?
Now that's very distinct, though, from working with gangs in El Salvador.
Of course, but you're not combating the U.S. is not combating gangs. Let's put that right out. The U.S. is not sending military to fight threats. What the U.S. is doing is helping train our partners in the region, bringing them up to the Western WINSEC over in Georgia, bringing them up to the Perry Center, to the American Defense College, bringing them together to help train them, providing some resources, military training, aid, things like that. But the U.S. is not on the ground, in the boots, fighting in the trenches against gangs. That's not occurring, right? So ultimately, these countries themselves are doing the fighting. But you have seen in these countries, particularly in Honduras with the rise of the PMOP, right, a militarized police being used to counter these security threats, particularly the gangs and then drug trafficking organizations. Why? Because the police are corrupt and inept. So until you reform the police, there is no chance that you'll actually be able to stop the levels of violence that you're seeing. The problem lies in, if you have military police, are you seeing a remilitarization of the region like we saw during the Cold War? I think it's too difficult to tell if that's actually the direction or if that's just a temporary thing. Many feel that it's the former as opposed to the latter.
So we can probably, so again, the expectation is that we are going to continue to help reform these institutions and not simply prop them up with more money.
Yes, absolutely. But and let's look at Central America. So if you look at the latest budget that President Trump is pushing, you've seen over $400 million towards Central America. Now it's not $750 billion. I mean, yeah, $750 million that we saw last year, right. But $400 million is a pretty good chunk of change. The question is, where does that money go? How is it distributed?
Right.
Are there going to be checks on?
Where is it going to have the most impact?
Precisely, and are there being checks on? Are you respecting human rights? Right. Are you reforming your police institutions so you don't have to rely on militarized police units?
Kind of oversight. Are you assassinating your journalists?
Precisely, and these are all important questions. But you cannot expect a continued blank check. Now, there's a big divide, and I think this is where a big conflict is, where you see people screaming about human rights and how we have to respect human rights and we should cut off funding if there's no human rights. Gotcha. But then I'm seeing a lot of the same people, not all of them, but I'm seeing a lot of the same people say, well, how are you going to cut off funding from the Central Americans and it's going to hurt them and you're going to see large levels of migration? It's very difficult to have both, so you have to look at levels of success, and like I said earlier, how do you define success?
Right.
And ultimately, how you define success is how you'll tell if it's a good scenario or not. You look at just homicide rates. Homicides in Honduras have gone down. Homicide rate in Guatemala has gone down. But you've seen a shoot up in El Salvador, right? So how do you define success? Is it just that indicator? Or are you looking at socioeconomic conditions? Because GDP has gone up. You've had GDP growth in all these countries.
But what's the Gini coefficient?
Precisely. So what is the inequality levels? What is the levels of inflation? They all matter. So
I don't mean to cut you off.
Yes.
But let's go to some questions that are coming up here. Actually, our director, Brian Fonseca, is fielding this one too.
He's actually supposed to be at the conference right now, so...
Right, I don't know what he's doing on here. But we'll go ahead and take this question because it's him. So he says, can you talk about the challenges to greater integration in the region? So what about Mexico's role in helping with Central American prosperity? And I think that's a great question. How can the rest of Latin America work with Central America and Central America itself? Like how can it integrate, and what can it do to kind of move forward on its own development?
No, it's absolutely critical. Particularly Mexico is critical, and I think it's so important that Mexico was here today at this conference because it speaks to the role and the partnership between the U.S. and Mexico in helping out our partners in Central America and Northern Triangle. Right? They have to be a part of anything because migration from Central America, violence from Central America, inequality and poverty and everything else associated with Central America affects both Mexico and the United States. So you need that. Now, with regard to economic integration, if you saw the two presidents and the vice president today speaking at the conference, President Hernandez spoke to the level of how security issues and economic inequality and economic issues in Honduras affects the United States as well as Mexico, right?
Right.
Same thing from Jimmy Morales, how one success story is success for everybody, right? And then you saw the Vice President of El Salvador talk right at the beginning about economic integration, not just with Northern Triangle, but being able to work with Mexico and the United States. So it's absolutely critical. But what we've seen, particularly from these conferences, is a lot of it is, yes, let's do it, let's set up a plan to do it, and then it falls flat. It doesn't actually continue. So what you need to have is not just after today and tomorrow with this conference, you need to set up a plan in place that you can actually go together. But there has to be investment. President Hernandez from Honduras today said that for every dollar the U.S. invests in Honduras, Honduras is providing $4. Now, if that's the case, that's a success story, and we can continue to build off that. That is something you saw.
It minimizes the risk to private institutions.
Precisely, but there has to be buy-in from the country. You saw it in Colombia.
Yeah.
So as much as the U.S. invested in Plan Colombia, you also had investment from Spain. You also had investment from the elite within Colombia. They said we need to help our own country. We can't just rely on the U.S. or Spain or other partners to do it for us. So I think if you have buy-in from the people, particularly the government, and you weed out and improve the institutions that ultimately lead to levels of corruption and violence, I think you have an opportunity for a success story. But it just can't be rhetoric at a conference today and tomorrow. It has to be action going forward.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. So, I'm asking your opinion.
Okay.
Do you think that some of these other states in the region, so Mexico, whether it's Mexico or the rest of Latin America, that wants to step up? Because Brian mentioned here that Colombia wants to become a security exporter, so
yes,
shifting away from being an aid recipient to being a country that can help in Central America and other areas. Mm-hmm. And I think they can bring a lot of experience to the region in terms of development, peace processes, security development, and even human security. I mean, they had kind of an issue with some of their human rights records that they've made an exponential effort to clean up. Mm-hmm. But I guess my question is in your opinion on this, do you think that maybe some of these countries are starting to offer to step up in the region because they feel like maybe the U.S. is going to withdraw a little bit?
Well, I'm not. Certainly, I think the perception may be that the U.S. is withdrawing. I'd caution everybody to say perhaps, but let's see, right? But the perception might still be there within these countries, particularly because the lack of emphasis on Latin America as a whole by President Trump. Obviously, he's been more focused on the Middle East and then all the internal domestic fighting that we see today. But I think Colombia is already doing this, and I think Brian would agree with me that Colombia has been doing this, albeit a smaller degree than we would like. Mm-hmm. But they've been working very closely with Honduras. President Hernandez today said how much they've been working with Colombia, and Chile's been an exporter for disaster relief efforts, and particularly after Haiti. Brazil was there, right? So there are countries in the region. The question is, to what level are they assisting? And I think you'll see a continued assistance by these countries as the U.S. pulls out, albeit financially. You can't expect for levels of economic support from the U.S. to maintain, particularly under President Trump. So I think, yes, it's important. I think they need to continue to have that dialogue, bringing in Mexico, bringing in Colombia, bringing in Chile. These are good steps going forward.
Do you think some of these countries, with even if it's only a little bit of aid that they can provide, whatever that aid might be, do you think they're bringing? Do you think the experience and the sociocultural awareness that they have, do you think that has a greater impact per dollar of aid that they put out, or per hour that they put out?
I wouldn't look at it in the context of aid, particularly. I'd look at the other things that you're getting with that aid, right? So military training, building capacities, building police capacities, understanding community-based approaches to policing as opposed to just traditional national polices, right? I think that's more efficient. So how do you work in hand with the population to, one, win good favor, right? Because perceptions of the police are very low in all these countries across the hemisphere, right? So how do you make good favor between the community and the police? So it has to be inside the country, but utilize the experiences of Mexico, utilize the experience of Colombia, utilize the training and support you're getting from the United States and Colombia to help build these institutions, to build trust within the communities, to advance the ultimate cause of the country, which is more socioeconomic opportunities and reduced levels of violence.
Has the OAS been trying to make that happen more
Yes,
and more?
yes. So actually, President Hernandez, again...
Organization of American States, if anybody watching doesn't know.
So he mentioned today MASI, right? And MASI is a program similar to CICIG. It's a little different in terms of execution, right? But essentially, it's supposed to look at cases of corruption and then charge, right? They're going to look at the Rosenthal case in Honduras. They're going to look at the Social Security issue, stealing from Social Security that was allegedly to occurred. But these are programs in place that are supposed to be independent investigations with zero influence from corrupt actors. Now, whether it will actually succeed or not, time will tell. It took CICIG a good 10 years before you actually started seeing some strong results, which ultimately led to the removal of President Autumn and President Molina. So it takes time. I think if we're looking for a magic bullet that's going to solve the problem tomorrow, you're going to be sorely disappointed.
There is not.
So there has to be a long-term strategy, utilizing what we have today and how we can continue to improve, not just financially, but other means, such as training, dual cooperations, etc.
In terms of that long-term strategy, you feel like the U.S. is going to continue the long-term strategies that they've had, even while maybe reducing funding or putting a little more into security.
And President Trump's been very pro bilateral engagement. There's pluses and minuses to that, right? So the plus is certainly that you can negotiate things on a more personal basis and how it affects my country versus your country. The problem with that is if you have one set of rules for one country and another set of rules for another country and vice versa, now you have 34 rules across the whole Latin American spectrum on how to do negotiations. It's very difficult and it's a strenuous bureaucratic process, and we have plenty of that in Washington already, right? So I think you need to work, and I think you'll continue to work in a bilateral way to a degree, but you can't ignore the multilateral approaches, particularly programs like Plan of the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle, which brings in all the countries of Central America together and distributes accordingly to the needs of those countries.
Interesting. We don't have any other questions. I think we can wrap this up, but one of the things that I love to speak to, we're interested in public policy.
Absolutely.
But I also want to, make sure that we speak to what the private sector's interest is in that public policy. So what does the private sector, we talked about PPPs a little bit. What else could we tell, the private sector, why should you be interested in Latin America, and, what should you be excited about in terms of U.S. policy down there? What can be an approach there where, it's a win for them and it also helps the region?
Well, I think businesses, particularly the private sector knows that there is opportunities in Latin America. The problem is not Latin America, right? The problem is how do we get them to invest in places with less than ideal conditions.
What are these countries and the U.S. doing about that?
So today is a perfect example. You have representatives from Microsoft. I mean, not from Microsoft, from Walmart. Representatives from Coca-Cola.
Interesting.
Different organizations that are here today They had an event yesterday at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right, talking about opportunities to invest in these countries.
What's the title of that conference?
Not entirely sure,
It was
but it's the Inter-American Conference of Mayors. Which
I threw you one curveball today.
Yes, you did throw me a curveball. But no, there was at the Colonnade as a pre-conference to this, hosted by the private sector, looking at opportunities that the private sector can invest within Central America. Different industries, particularly the textiles, the agricultural industries, right? The telemarketing industry, right? These are all industries that are working very well in Central America. They just need more of it.
Right.
So how do we get businesses to expand into Central America as opposed to going to the traditional powers like Colombia, like Mexico, like Brazil, like Chile?
Where you have a larger market.
Precisely. You know. How do we get them to go into Central America? You've seen some success stories. Haynes, right? In the gang report, we looked at Team, right?
Remember you mentioning textiles is a big one in Central America.
It's a huge, and telemarketing is another one, right? So you're seeing increase in telemarketing in all these countries because you don't need a lot of job skill training. But you need the private sector and to work with the public sector to do skills training so you could have more technological jobs and not just manual labor jobs.
Well, and you're working with, when you find PPPs, let's talk about infrastructure for 1 second. Again, you know, we need to wrap this up, but when we talk about infrastructure, you know, there's a lot of infrastructure projects in Latin America, including Central America, and those are primarily public-private partnerships that are available to the private sector. Now, you know, if I'm not mistaken, in most cases, a lot of the risk involved with those, and this is where the incentive comes to the private sector when it comes to, you know, public policy, is that a lot of the risk is absorbed by these countries themselves or by whatever U.S. program is promoting it. So, can you speak to that for just 30 seconds?
Our topic in 30 seconds. I'll try my best, but certainly I think the infrastructure needs to be in place where it's a conducive environment to private sector investment, right? But that infrastructure right now is unfortunately erratic. It's not really there. You have changing of the guards and governments consistently within the region. You just had a president removed in Guatemala. You have ultimately a gang war going on right now in El Salvador, leading to the most violent place in the world. You have a presidential election this year in Honduras in November that if the president loses, right, a chance at a re-election, now you have a different approach to governance than he had. So how does that affect private sector investment? How does that affect current relations with the United States? Things change so rapidly in Latin America, but there has to be buy-in, not just from current administrations, but administrations going forward to put in the infrastructure that needs to be in place to get economic investment by private sector companies.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for, unless you want to say anything else. No,
thank you all for joining in, and keep following on state.gov so you can continue to see breakout sessions and things from the conference. I think it's very important. Oftentimes, it's a paradox because people don't pay attention about Central America until Central America really affects the United States. But geographically speaking, it's probably one of the most important partners in the hemisphere. Is one of the most important regions to the United States and U.S. policy, even though all we like to hear about is the sexy topics, right, that are going on in the world. I think Latin America is we often forget about, but we can't overlook it.
But it matters to us. You know, I mean,
it matters to us more than a lot of the issues facing the world, to be honest with you.
When you're talking about the cost of trade, I mean, it goes down exponentially when we kind of keep it within this region. Anyway, there's so many topics that we could cover here. I want to say thank you to anyone that is viewing this now and anyone that's going to view it later. If you do have further questions, you can leave them in the comment section, and we'll try to follow up. Whenever I can catch Randy or whenever I can catch Brian or anybody else who wants to ask questions of here.
Good luck with Brian.
Thank you for watching, and go ahead and, if you're not already doing it, follow our page. Go ahead and share it with your friends. You know, set your notifications so you can get updates when we do go live, and you know, stay informed on everything that has to do with public policy in the world, and you know, our specialty, Latin America, over here with our analysts like Randy.
Appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, and have a beautiful day.